For centuries, the Catholic Church has presented itself as the moral compass for all of humanity. It's a bold claim, but when you look closely, especially at its teachings on sex, you start to see a system that's full of paradoxes and some pretty surprising contradictions. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack the fascinating and sometimes baffling logic behind the Church's authority on what it calls natural law.
Here's how we're going to do it. First, we'll tackle the Church's claim to have a kind of monopoly on morality. Then, we'll see what happens when a supposedly unchanging law, changes. We'll zero in on the big flashpoint, sexual ethics, and then really question the internal logic of the rules. And finally, we'll look at the Church's very modern and very different approach to mercy.
All right, so first things first, the central claim. Why does the Catholic Church believe it has this unique, God-given right to be the final word on moral law for absolutely everyone?
Well, it all boils down to this one big concept, natural law. The idea is that there are moral truths kind of baked into the universe, and we can figure them out using our reason. But, and this is a huge but, the Church says our reason is broken. It's flawed by what it calls original sin. So, left to our own devices, we're going to get it wrong. We're prone to bias, confusion, and just plain old self-deception.
And they believe they have the scriptural receipts for this. They point to Matthew's gospel, where Jesus gives Peter the keys of the kingdom. They see that as the power to make binding moral decisions. They cite St. Paul talking about a law written on our hearts, which the Church's job is to illuminate. And, crucially, they believe Jesus promised the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete, would guide the Church and prevent it from ever formally teaching error on big issues of faith and morals.
So when you put it all together, the Church sees itself as a kind of moral compass. It's not that you can't figure out which way is north on your own, but you're probably going to get lost in the woods. The Church claims to be the divinely calibrated instrument that keeps all of humanity from just wandering off the moral map entirely.
Okay, but here's where the story gets really interesting. If this law is divine and unchanging, how can it look so different over time? Well, the Church has a name for this. It's called the development of doctrine.
Let's just look at the track record. For hundreds of years, charging any interest on a loan, usury, was considered a grave sin against nature. Today, your Catholic bank is doing just fine. The Church once taught that governments had a duty to suppress other religions. Then, in 1965, it declared religious freedom a fundamental human right. And for a very long time, while it condemned the brutality of the slave trade, it didn't teach that slavery itself was always and everywhere evil. Today, it absolutely does. It seems the true north on that divine compass has moved a lot.
And nowhere, I mean nowhere, is this tension more explosive than in the realm of sexual ethics. This is where ancient and frankly incorrect biology smashes right into modern understanding, forcing the Church into some incredible intellectual gymnastics to keep the rules the same, even when the reasons for them have completely changed.
You see, the original reason for banning things like contraception or masturbation was based on a totally debunked scientific theory called preformationism. The belief was that every single sperm contained a tiny, perfectly formed little person, a homunculus. The woman's womb was basically just an oven. So under that logic, spilling the seed wasn't just wasteful, it was essentially a form of microscopic murder.
But then, microscopes got better. Science proved that whole idea was completely wrong. So did the Church change the rule? Nope. It changed the reason. The argument today isn't biological anymore, it's philosophical. The idea is that in marriage, sex has to be a total gift of self. And if you intentionally block your fertility, you're holding something back. You're making the act a dishonest gift. The rule is exactly the same, but the logic behind it is night and day.
This whole crisis came to a head in 1968. Pope Paul VI put together a huge commission. We're talking scientists, doctors, theologians, and even married Catholic couples to study birth control. After all their work, a huge majority, around 80% of them, recommended changing the teaching. They said, hey, a marriage can be fruitful and open to life as a whole, even if every single act isn't. It made a ton of sense, but the Pope overruled them. He chose to double down on the traditional ban, mainly to preserve the appearance of consistency.
And the result of that decision? A credibility crisis of epic proportions. Today, something like 90% of Catholic women in the U.S. have used a form of contraception that the Church officially labels intrinsically evil. When your law is that disconnected from the actual lives of your followers, your authority starts to look pretty shaky.
And that massive disconnect makes you ask an even deeper question.
If almost nobody is following the rule, maybe the problem isn't with the people. Maybe the rule itself isn't as logical as it claims to be. When you really apply the church's own framework, you end up in some very strange places.
And here we go. Get a load of this quote from St. Thomas Aquinas, the absolute giant of Catholic theology, the main architect of natural law. He wrote that sins against nature, like using contraception, are actually graver than sins like rape. I know, it sounds completely insane. How could one of the most brilliant minds in history believe something so morally backward? Well, his logic was that messing with the biological design of an organ is a direct insult to God, the designer. In his very specific technical view, rape, as horrible as it is, still uses the sexual organs for their natural purpose. But contraception actively thwarts that purpose. The problem is, this reveals a massive double standard. Think about eating. Its natural purpose is nutrition. But the church is incredibly relaxed about gluttony, which also thwarts the natural purpose of our digestive system. One is intrinsically evil, the other is basically an oopie.
And here's the kicker, the real historical irony. St. Thomas Aquinas himself, whose nickname was the Dumb Ox, was famously profoundly obese. So much so that they literally had to cut a huge crescent shape out of his desk just so he could fit behind it. So the man writing the book on respecting the natural order of the body was himself a walking contradiction to his own philosophy when it came to food.
You know, this isn't some modern cheap shot. The church was warned about exactly this kind of thing 1,600 years ago. St. Augustine himself said, look, it's dangerous for non-believers to hear a Christian talking nonsense about the natural world. Why? Because if they know you're obviously wrong about things they can see with their own two eyes, they're never going to trust you when you start talking about stuff they can't see, like God and salvation.
And all of this leads to what you could call a boy who cried wolf effect. When the church puts a married couple using a condom in the same moral category, intrinsically evil, as genocide or torture, the words just lose their power. If every sin is turned up to an 11, pretty soon nothing feels like a sin at all. The moral language gets totally devalued. So this leaves the modern church in a really tough spot. The intellectual framework seems to be cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. So what's the endgame? Well, they've developed a kind of pastoral workaround, a way to solve the problem in the real world without ever having to officially admit the theory was wrong.
This is where Pope Francis comes in. In a landmark 2016 document called Amoris Laetitia, he effectively created a conscience clause. He dramatically shifted the focus away from rigid one-size-fits-all rules and onto what's called the internal forum. That's basically a private discernment process between a person, their priest, and their own well-formed conscience. The law is still held up as the ideal, but your conscience gets the final say on how it applies to your messy, complicated life.
So now you have this kind of official cognitive dissonance. On one hand, you have the law. This is what's officially right. It claims perfect consistency with tradition, and it's what keeps the old Aquinas model on the books. But then on the other hand, you have the conscience. This is what's pastorally correct. It aligns with science and real-life experience, and it's practiced every day in the privacy of the confessional. The church gets to be right in theory and correct in practice.
Which of course brings us back to where we started, but with a final massive question. The church's whole claim to authority began with the idea that it was the essential moral compass for a world that couldn't trust its own judgment. But if the modern solution is to ultimately tell people, in the end, you have to follow your own conscience, then what happens to the compass?